Okay, Chapter 12, Controversies in Trade Policy. Controversies in Trade Policy. This Chapter 2 consists of two parts. Number one part is arguments for activist trade policy. Okay? And Section 2 is arguments concerning trade and people. Today, we just focus on Section 2, arguments concerning trade and people. This Section 2 consists of three subsections. Subsection number 1, trade and low wage labor, right? So, and Section 2, trade and the environment. And Section 3 is trade and culture. Okay? Before starting Section 2, I'd like to overview Section 1 only. So, arguments for activist trade policy. So, Chapter 7 and 8, we studied externality problem, scale economies. Or then some trade theory should be changes when the market is not perfect. Okay. Also, Chapter 10 and Chapter 10 we studied so development problem. Developmental economies face market failures. In these two cases, some trade policy should be little changes. So, okay. So, we studied Ricardian model and Heckscher-Ohlin model, right? Based on when the market is perfectly competitive. Okay? Then we can, the theory of international trade is Ricardian model or Heckscher-Ohlin model. We already know that. But market is not perfect, right? In perfect competitive market is not perfect. Then the reason for imperfect market is scale economies, and market failures, right? Then theory of international trade different. Okay, I said international trade theory based on imperfect market, right? Scale economies or externality, right? So in these areas, the author of this book, Paul Krugman, contributed a lot. And because of this contribution, he received Nobel Prize. Okay? So that is, simply talking, strategic trade policy. So strategic trade policy have a meaning when the market is not perfect. Okay? That is a section, content of Section 1. Treats these ideas. So now we go back, neoclassical theory of international trade, Ricardian or Heckscher-Ohlin model. Anyway, comparative advantage matter. So government intervention is meaningless. Okay? That is a conclusion. But in this imperfect market structure, some government intervention, right, can change it. So outcome of international trade. In that sense, strategic trade policy. Okay? That is Section 1. Just some activist trade policy. Some activist trade policy can change some competitiveness. Right? That is story of Section 1. But I'd like to skip this. And I'd like to go Section 2 directly. Arguments concerning trade and people. So think about what is the meaning of trade and low wage labor. Now think about monthly wage in least developing countries is very low. For example, less than $30 per month for Southeast Asian, some developing countries. Wage rate too low, right? So then some humanitarian group, activist group, or developed countries argue that we cannot compete with this low wage product. We cannot developed country cannot compete with developing countries' exports because these exports produced use of very low wages. Okay? So developed countries propose. So one argument of developed countries' economies is that the products from low wage labor in developing countries should be checked using some international regulation, international law. Okay, but this is not the case from the perspective of economics. Actually, this kind of argument is firstly negotiated in UR. We studied in chapter 11, chapter 10, I think, right? But developing countries did not accept this kind of regulation. The argument is very simple. If wage rate in developing countries increase, right, then what happened? Developing countries lose competitiveness at world market. Okay? Then what happened? Developing countries cannot lose chance to increasing per capita GDP later after increasing wages suddenly. Okay? Based on Ricardian model, think about wage rate in developing countries increase, then what happened? They lose competitiveness, price competitiveness as a world. Okay? And no chance to increasing productivity and increasing wage rate after this. So, this hiring wage rate in developing countries sounds like some humanitarian, some favor, or it's a good idea for developing countries. But in real world, this results in low per capita GDP permanently. Okay? So that is idea of trade and low wage labor. Section 2 is trade and the environment. Usually developed countries has lots of regulations on pollution abatement. Okay? So developed countries emit less than developing countries. Okay? So some environmental activists or some developed countries argue that environmental protection required before exporting the products. Okay? It sounds like very good, especially for developing countries. But real outcome is the opposite. What happens if developing countries introduce some abatement machinery, for example? That means cost for production increase, right? Then price of exports increase. Why? Think about environmental costs added in total cost, okay? Then they have to sell at higher price than before, right? Same to low wages and low wage issue, same thing, right? Then what happens? Consumers do not want to purchase some developing countries' products at higher price, right? That means environmental protection result in higher costs, and after that, developing countries lose competitiveness, price competitiveness at world market, right? So they lost chance to increase some productivity or something after all, right? That is second issue. And third issue is trade and culture, right? So I'd like to explain a little later. Okay, now we then go subsection directly. Trade and low wages. Slide number 23. Manufacturing exports from low and middle income countries. Low and middle income countries means low per capita GDP country. right? Low GNI countries. So manufactured exports from developing countries have been increasing. We already studied this in chapter 11 after 1980s, okay? Compared to rich high-income country standards, workers who produce these goods are paid low wages and may work under poor conditions, right? The developing countries' workers receive low wages and work under really disgusting, poor working conditions. Okay? Some have opposed free trade for this reason. Right? One example of this situation is maquiladora sector, Mexican firm that produce for export to the United States. Right? So maquiladora is free, some duty-free export region. Right? So now think about that is California, right? And here there is Mexico and Canada, right? In these borders between two countries, right? Area of borders of two countries, right? Maquiladora located. Okay? Usually we know that wage rate in United States is very expensive. Right? And wage rate in Mexican workers is very low, featured by very low. Right? Also think about automobile production, automobile industry. Lots of some cars produced in the United States border. Right? But they have some competitiveness pressure because of high wage rate. Okay? So some process should be exported to Mexico to down the production cost. Okay? Now think about automobile industries, right? Parts and components, production of parts and components or design of cars should be done. This kind of process is done in the United States border because Mexican workers cannot do this kind of thing because of low productivity and low capability in technology, right? So United States, after United States firm producing so parts and components, right? This one exported to maquiladora firm in Mexico. And in maquiladora firm assembled, U.S. produced parts and components. Right? And final car re-exported United States market without tariff, for example. Can you understand? So that is, maquiladora is sort of export processing zone. Right? So exploiting low wages in Mexico. So that is example for this. Opponents of North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, have argued that it's now easier for employers to replace high-wage workers in the U.S. with low-wage workers in Mexico. That is true. Okay? The above claim can be true, but we cannot conclude that trade hurts workers. Trade hurts workers, Mexican workers and United States workers. No evidence for that. Okay? A Ricardian model predicts that while wages in Mexico should remain lower than those in the U.S. due to low productivity in Mexico, they will rise relative to their pre-trade level. Anyway, after trade, what happened in Mexican maquiladora workers' wage rate? Anyway, after trade, right? So in Ricardian model, think about U.S. workers' skill and human capital and physical capital has United States has a comparative advantage in, that's actually model. So anyway, more productive, okay? They receive higher wages. And Mexican workers featured by low productivity, right? So receive low wages. Anyway, after trade between two countries, wage rate in both countries increase, right? Wage rate in maquiladora workers increase after trade. Okay? So you saw that was some midterm exam question, isn't it? Okay? You calculate or solve this kind of thing. So a Ricardian model predicts that while wages in Mexico should remain lower than those in the United States, right? U.S. higher than Mexico, right? In autarky, for example. After trade, what happened? Wage rate in U.S. after trade still higher than wage rate in Mexico after trade. Okay? That is true. But this one greater than pre-trade wage rate. Okay? So the arguments that trade hurts Mexican workers is not validated empirically. Okay? Also, Heckscher-Ohlin model, the prediction is this. United States has a comparative advantage in human capital or physical capital intensive sectors, or human capital and physical capital intensive process in automobile production, whereas Mexico has comparative advantage in unskilled labor intensive process, assembly process in manufacturing car, for example, right? But it is also predicted that unskilled workers in Mexico will gain. Anyway, Heckscher-Ohlin model's prediction says U.S. is human capital or some skilled labor intensive production or capital intensive sectors. U.S. has a comparative advantage in skilled labor and physical capital intensive sectors, right? And Mexico has comparative advantage in unskilled labor intensive sector, unskilled labor intensive process. That is assembly. That is production of parts and components, for example, right? So after trade, then what happened? Unskilled labor abundant Mexico has comparative advantage in unskilled intensive production of assembly, processes of assembly, right? So after trade, this unskilled labor's wage rate increase, right? So it doesn't matter, Ricardian or Heckscher-Ohlin model. Mexican workers' wage rate increase, right? This is also empirically verified. And this says the earlier argument that trade hurts low-wage workers in developing countries is meaningless, misleading, okay? Despite the low wages earned by workers in Mexico, both theories predict that those workers are better off, in other words, wage rate increase with trade, than they would be if trade had not taken place. Okay? Think about an autarky situation. Evidence consistent with these predictions would show that wages in Maquiladora have risen relative to wages in other Mexican sectors. If we look at the real data, what happened after conclusion NAFTA? Wage rate in Maquiladora firms, wage rate in Maquiladora firm increase, right? But also think about wage rate in non-Maquiladora workers in Mexico, right? This one, compared to non-Maquiladora workers' wage rate, Maquiladora workers' wage rate increase, okay? That is here. Maquiladora have risen relative to wages in other Mexican sectors. One could also compare working conditions in Maquiladoras with the working conditions in other Mexican sectors, rather than with those in the U.S. Right? After trade, anyway, wage rate increase in trade sector. Can you understand? That is famous thing. So, table 12.3, skipped. And we go, slide number 28. Okay, before that, I'd like to give another example. When I'm doing development consulting for a Cambodian government about more than almost 20 years ago, right? Okay, the other example. One NGO group So when Vietnam, so humanitarian groups and U.S. congressmen visits Vietnam formed in early 20th century or late 19th century, and they shocked, right? Vietnamese workers' wage rate is very low, right? And working conditions is really bad compared with those in the United States. Actually, this firm produced some unskilled labor-intensive products and exported to United States, some discount store like Walmart or something. So U.S. consumers can purchase toys and clothing with cheaper price. Okay, and U.S. congressmen and humanitarian activists shocked to find really too low wages and really bad working conditions. Also, they shocked more to find that usually lots of child labor used here, employed in this Vietnam farm. Okay, so they shocked, and they decided to help some children, right, exploiting low wages, to help the Vietnam some laborers. They banned imports from this farm. U.S. imports banned from these farms to help Vietnam's laborers. And they expect usually children should be back to school instead of working. Okay? And the NGO, I said NGO group also visited here. And this NGO group, I forgot the name of that NGO. The NGO group, they visited Vietnam, right? To check their expectation realized or not. Whether their expectation realized or not. Okay? And they shocked. Right? Lots of some, their wage rate same, and lots of children, most of children, about more than 90% of children still working. Right? The NGO trace earlier workers before U.S. imports ban. Right? And they shocked. They expect most of children back to school, but that didn't happen. Okay? Usually they work in other Vietnam firms with much lower wage rate. Right? Wage rate, they still work with lower wage rate than before. Okay? Also, lots of girl workers, right, became prostitute instead of studying at school. Can you understand? That is a really, really important example. Lots of people said, I'm a very good person, good-natured person, so we should help some poor laborers or poor children, right? And they ban trade. The result is just the opposite of expectation. They receive much lower wage rate than before, and lots of girls became prostitutes. Okay? Anyway, 28 of slide number 28. Some labor activists want to include labor standards in trade negotiation. That happened in UR, as I said before. Right? So, using this cheap labor is violation of some human rights or fair trade. So, we have to ban this kind of practice. However, labor standards, so wage rate or working conditions, imposed by foreign countries are opposed by governments of low and middle income countries and the UR negotiation at the time, right? So at that time, Mahathir, Malaysian Prime Minister, still, now he back to Prime Minister again, right? He opposed really severely for developed countries' argument or human rights groups' arguments to introduce this kind of some high standards in developing countries. His argument was very simple. If wage rate increase, working condition better, improve, then what happened? Developing countries have to produce same good with higher cost, right? And should be sold at world market at higher price. But that doesn't happen. Real result is very simple. They lost chance to export the products in world market, and they lost chance to increase wage rate because productivity increased over time and over time, right? So their miserable situation continues. That is Dr. Marty's argument at the time. International standards could be used as a protectionist policy. So conclusion of UR is that these arguments, developed countries or human rights groups' argument, is protectionist policy, right? That it was protectionist policy or a basis for lawsuit when domestic producers did not meet them. So that is protectionist policy, disguised protectionist policy. Standards set by high-income countries would be expensive for low and middle-income producers. I said, wage rate increase, they lose everything. Okay? So that would be expensive for low and middle-income producers. At the time, Dr. Mahathir, Malaysian Prime Minister, said to developed countries group or humanitarian group, study history. Your grandfathers and grandmoms' wage rate was very low in the United States or European countries until 20th century, right? So the grandparents' wage rate was very similar to wage rate now in these developing countries, right? But after that, wage rate is very low because productivity is very low. But productivity increase and increase like this after time, right? So wage rate also increase and increase. Now your wage rate in your country is very high. But developing country now start industrialization, so wage rate is very low. Okay? If wage rate increased to this level or half of this level, they lost everything because they lost chance to increase in productivity after all and to become high-income countries. Can you understand? That also, Les Miserables story, Chang-Balchang story, right? Early in older countries experience same thing, really bad working condition and really low wage rate before passing the back tunnel of early capitalism, featured by low wage rate. Okay? So you have to know the background of Les Miserables, background of this story. Same thing happened in Korea. Early, John Tae-il suicided himself, fired himself, and died. That was, I think, about 1967 or 8, like this. At the time, wage rate very low because our productivity is very low, right? But after that, what happened? Wage rate increase and increase and increase, right? So why? Productivity increase. Increasing productivity is a continuous process over time. So lots of people believe that. So in 1986, for example, after some democratic movement, our wage rate increased because at the time, productivity increased. That is background of the success of union movement, democratic movement, right? That was argument by Mahathir. Okay, a policy that could be agreeable for government of low and middle income countries is a system that monitors wages and working conditions and makes this information available to consumers. Think the concept of fair trade, right? Some coffee companies, purchase African coffee with a higher cost than market price. And importing that, they sell coffee in developed countries with higher cost than market price. Okay, that is concept of fair trade commission. So products could be certified as made with acceptable wage rate and working conditions, guaranteed in this case. But this policy would have a limited effect since a large majority of workers in low and middle income countries do not work in this export sector. Most of workers work in other firms with lower wage rate than exported sector, fair trade sector. Can you understand? That is the final point of subsection number 1. Subsection number 2 was titled by Trade and the Environment. Compared to high-income developed country standards, environmental protection, environmental standards in low and middle-income countries are lax, very low. Some have opposed free trade for this reason. I already explained the background of this, right? So when developing country exports goods with lots of emission of pollutants should be checked by the WTO. That was some developed countries, economists and environmental activists' arguments in UR negotiation. This one is also opposed by developing countries. Some have opposed free trade for this reason, right? That is argument of environmental activists and some economists for developed countries. But we cannot conclude that trade hurts the environment, okay? Same logic. So we already studied in earlier subsection, trade do not hurt the labor, right? Wages. Similarly, trade hurts the environment since consumption and production in the absence of trade have degraded the environment. Real reason for degradation is consumption and production instead of exports or free trade, okay? Some environmental activists want to include environmental standards in trade negotiations. That was talked in UR, though, right? However, environmental standards imposed by developed countries are opposed by governments of developing countries, low and middle income countries at that time. International standards could be used as a protection. The conclusion is saying international standards should be disguised protectionist policy by developed countries or basis for lawsuits when domestic producers in developing countries did not meet them. Okay? Some standards in environment set by developed countries would be expensive for low and middle income producers. Okay? So this one is introduced then. Maybe some firms in developing countries have equipped, so purchase some pollution abatement machinery or something. That leads to increase in cost for production. To produce same good, higher cost resulted. That means then developing countries firm can have to sell the same product with higher price than before. This erodes competitiveness of world market, right? Because of this, it is likely that developing countries lose chance to increase productivity over time, okay? Or to become rich countries, okay? As poor countries grow richer, partly due to trade, they produce more and can consume more, leading to more environmental degradation. Production and consumption is main reason for environmental degradation instead of trade. But as countries grow richer, they want to pay for more stringent environmental protection. That happens in developed countries, high-income countries, right? United States, European countries number one, right? United States firm also do this thing. Korea also same. Korean firm have to use some pollution abatement, some equipment to produce something. That is law, right? So firms have to satisfy. Both of these ideas are represented as an environmental kuznets. an inverted U-shaped relationship between environmental degradation and income per person. Right? That figure 12.3 is environmental Kuznets curve. What is this? Right? That is income per person, per capita income, right? And Y variable is environmental damage or degradation, right? In early stage of development, right? Early stage of development, so production increase, then environmental degradation increase. But after reaching a certain level, right? Some people's consciousness of environmental preservation increase, and maybe they regulation some implemented after reaching developed country, right? Then after that, environmental degradation decrease. So U-shaped one, right? So income increase like this. Now think about A, B, C, D, right? Maybe EU is located near here, right? And Korea may be near here, right? What happened in China? China should be at this stage like this. Okay? Per capita income increase, reaching at this point and decrease after arriving at development level, at certain level of development. Actually, we said that is Kuznets, some inverted U-shaped curve, Kuznets curve. Original Kuznets curve is environmental Kuznets curve. Original Kuznets curve is different. That is per capita income. X variable is per capita income, and Y variable is income inequality. Right? So, as I said before, after studying industrialization, per capita income increase. Right? Per capita income increase. But at the same time, income inequality also increase. That is the experience of UK and Germany and United States and in France. You know Chang-Soo story. Les Miserables story happened here. Income inequality increase. Right? In this early stage of development, all the countries experience same thing. Right? Low wage rate, really bad working condition. Korea, now developing countries experience this kind of thing. And Korea experienced this one in 1960s and 1970s. Right? Now, least developing countries experience this one. But anyway, after reaching a certain level of development of per capita income inequality decrease. Okay? So, early stage of development is really a bad thing for humankind. We have no option but to experience. Okay? So, write this. That is original Kuznets curve. Income inequality increase in the early stage of development, but after society stabilizes because productivity increase, then get better. Can you understand? And in chapter 11, we studied East Asian miracle. East Asian countries experience quite different some things. Per capita income increase. So in case of Korea, also East Asian countries' case is like this. Income inequality decrease. Right? When per capita GDP increase. Until 1985, mid-1980s. After that, income inequality increase. Right? So in that sense, lots of some neoclassical economists said East Asian miracle. That is East Asian one of East Asian miracle story. Income inequality will decrease in the case of early stage of development in developed East Asian countries. Okay, anyway, that is original Kuznets curve. And that is environmental cuisine score, right? So look at this. Empirical evidence suggests that as economies grow, they initially do increasing environmental damage, but they become more environmentally friendly once they become sufficiently rich. China, where the environment is deteriorating as the economy expands, is in fact moving A to B. Now China moving here to here, right? A to B. Richer countries may be moving C to D. Now Korea or United States or developing countries moving C to D. Okay? Using some of their growth to improve the environment. Okay? Next slide. Because rich countries, high-income countries usually have strict environmental regulations and poor countries do not. Environmentally hazardous activities may be moved to poor countries. That is the story of pollution heaven in slide number 34. Pollution heaven. It's a place where an economic activity that is subject to strict environmental control in high-income countries is moved to other countries with less strict regulation. Okay? So that is a pollution heaven story. That was really popular until early 1990s, actually. At the time, China, developed countries introduced some strict environmental regulation. That means production costs increase, right? Then some companies, usually declining industries in developed countries, textile sector or some toy sector, right? Labor-intensive sector or labor-intensive firm, then moving to developing countries where there exists no environmental regulation, right? Anyway, they sell their products at the world market, okay, with no change in export price if they moving to China or Vietnam at the time. Can you understand? Then, in some developing countries, lots of some pollution emitting firms prosper gather in some developing countries. That is the story of pollution heaven, right? Yeah, there is evidence that pollution heavens are insignificant relative to the pollution that occurs without international trade. That is true. That kind of story is empirically verified, but not so significant, right? That is a meaning only for declining industries, right? So that doesn't show that is really important and crucial point, okay? That is true, but not so significant, okay? That is 34 of this chapter. And now we go slide number 35, figure 12.4, carbon dioxide emission. Look at this. The rapid economic growth of China has turned it from a minor factor in climate change to the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide. China is the number one country to emitting carbon dioxide most now, right? China is number one now. That is the background why climate in Montreal, some agreement said only developed countries have to cut their CO2 emissions. And developing countries have no responsibility to do the same measures. But if we look at this figure 12.4, developing countries' contribution in air pollution is really severe. Okay? So from after that, lots of developing countries is likely to have some burdens to emit less than before. Okay? Responsibility of emission of pollutions. Okay? That is background. 12.4 is background of that kind of some changes in climate change negotiation. And slide number 36. Pollution in some countries may cause negative externality for other countries. For example, production in China could cause air pollution in Korea, right? So that is 미세먼지 story, right? To the degree that pollution causes a negative externality for other countries, they should want to include it in international negotiation. Korean government actually, I don't know this government, but earlier government want to include it in international negotiations, right? Emissions of carbon dioxide is an example of pollution that causes a negative externality, and that has been included in international negotiation. But China is not so active in this negotiation, right? So it's really difficult to include this kind of issue, solve this kind of issue in international negotiation, basically. And about 50 years ago, in 1970s, Korea emitted lots of pollutants at the time. So southern area, eastern southern area, right? At the time, Korea started petrochemical industrialization, right? Lots of company in Busan, Pohang, Ulsan, right? And lots of pollutants flowed into Japan. At that time, Japanese government want international solve this kind of problem, right? At that time, Korea causes some negative externality to Japanese economy, but Japanese people don't now understand that kind of thing. But Korean people do not know what this kind of issue was important, was happened in 1970s actually, right? Same thing happened now between China and Korea. Okay, so it's really difficult to solve this kind of problem from national negotiation. Okay, and finally we go subsection number 3, trade and culture. Some activists believe that trade destroys culture in other countries. This belief neglects the principle that we should allow people to define their culture through the choices that they make, not through standards set by others. Also, any economic change, not just trade, leads to change in everyday life. Culture. Now think about, screen quota policy? Actually, Korean government until only year 2000 or something, right? We use screen quota policy. Screen quota policy. All the movie theater have to play the maximum something percent of Hollywood movie, US movie, right? So, and domestic movie should be learn about how many percent of something story. That is screen quota policy. That is the meaning of this, related to this issue. Also, another country famous for this kind of activist arguments is France, right? Only France and Korea is really important country in this argument actually. But this says why government have to decide, right? Korean people or French have to enjoy domestically produced movie instead of Hollywood movie. Okay? That is the idea of this one. This belief neglects the principle that we should allow people to define their culture. Everybody, consumers, have to decide their own culture. Why governments intervene to enjoy domestic culture, for example, right? Through the choices that they make, not through standards set by others. Also, any economic change, not just trade, is a reason for changes in everyday life. Can you understand? Actually, there are lots of related issues in screen quadropathy. Lots of Korea activist group also argues that, right, domestically produced movies should be, right, have some preference to Hollywood movie or foreign movie, right? And lots of activists at the time used some UNESCO clause of preservation of some domestic culture. But UNESCO regulation is that some domestically, historical and domestic, some valuable intrinsic culture should be preserved, right? That means some special, some culture with historical background, right, should be preserved. But at the time, Korean movies topic was largely gangster movie. Gangster movie is not related to preservation of own culture at all. So that kind of arguments should be misleading, I think. Okay, I'd like to stop chapter 11.